So, Dark Souls 2 was released to critical acclaim. DLC was announced, a re-release titled Scholar of the First Sin was on the horizon. Everything was hunky-dory for Souls fans, at least the fans who enjoyed the second game. Little did fans know there was yet another treat for them. At E3 2014, Bloodborne was announced, and it actually caught my interest. I watched the reveal trailer and was immediately intrigued. A Lovecraftian Victorian London with monsters? Count me the fuck in. The premise was so damn cool, and I didn't even know it was a Souls game until I was told afterward that it would be in the same vein. However, I kinda just forgot about it until I got it as a Christmas gift in 2015. It's important to note that this was my first Souls experience, and it's something I hold very precious. It's really weird to explain this to somebody that hasn't experienced the Souls series before, but trust me, it's something beyond the first playthrough of any other game. It's a type of learning experience that's very prophetic, and it's something that's very close to me. If you feel that my opinion will be compromised in any way because of that, you have been warned. There's no footage nonsense to go over, the footage in this review will all be mine. Without further ado, it's time to review Bloodborne. The game opens very abruptly, with a witch doctor of sorts asking for you to enter into a contract. I'm not really sure what compels your character to trust him, but you really have no choice in the matter. After you've created your character, you get devoured by baby skeletons, only to have you wake up shortly afterwards and are given free reign over your character. Once again, a Souls plot will always be a Souls plot. Throughout the game, you learn about the Hunter's Dream and the world of Yharnam through character dialogue and item descriptions. Not much has changed in that department. Like all the other games, it's really more about the lore and characters, who this time around deliver something a bit more memorable than 2's cast of downtrodden losers. While I don't think the characters quite reach the level of those found in the first Dark Souls, they still do leave an impression worth noting. My favorite character arc has to be with a man named Alfred. When you first meet him, he's very unassuming in his tone and approach. He's essentially just an info dump about vile bloods and the healing church. That is, until you give him a letter to Cainhurst Castle. He starts to break character slightly, seemingly excited that he's allowed to go into Cainhurst to follow in the footsteps of his master. If you go to look for him there, he will have killed the queen of the vile bloods, Annalise. He undergoes a complete tonal shift with a giant wheel, blood all over him, and the tone of a sociopath driven by a mad sense of retribution. He even threatens to fight you if you stand in his way. It always fascinated me how they flipped a character on his head in such a violent way. Alfred isn't the only NPC though. In fact, you can recruit various NPCs into your safe space. At some point, you stumble across a small church where you can house NPCs. You'll attract whores, skeptics, and cannibals if you happen to judge a certain NPC incorrectly. While it isn't your hub, since that's the job of the Hunter's Dream, it's a nice place to hang around to see how each character changes. You recruit an old lady to stay there, and as the game goes on, she'll go a bit crazy until she leaves, assumedly because she committed suicide or something. Then there's a lady you save from captivity in the Hypogean Gaol. If you keep taking blood from the whore instead of from the captive will get so jealous that she kills the whore. I'm not even joking, this is a real thing that can happen. It's such a step up from the static text blurbs that were the NPCs of Dark Souls 2. It's very evident that Miyazaki is behind the helm again with his world building because oh my do we have quite the spectacle. In my opinion, Yharnam has the best art design in the entire series. This may just be my preference for Lovecraftian themes, but I just love it so much. Every area is dark and dreary, yet somehow interesting no matter where you are. The desolate streets of Yharnam are plagued with insanity. The forbidden woods wind in and out with an air of fear that gripped me everywhere I went. Cainhurst Castle is absolutely gorgeous on the outside, but on the inside it is absolute terror, with ghosts and small creatures lurking around every corner to snatch you up and murder you. Every area reeks of fear, a weapon that Bloodborne utilizes quite effectively. It starts you off with only your bare hands, asking you to punch a giant wolf to death. Of course, the wolf eviscerated me because I stood zero chance and apparently don't know what a workout routine is, because these arms be twigs. However, you're transported to the Hunter's Dream, given a few weapons, and you can go to town on that bitch. Sweet, sweet revenge. This event was crucial to my psychological understanding of the game going forward. My character is very fragile. The wolf can take you out in only a few hits, and even with a weapon, I still felt that weakness at my core. Going forward, I was extremely cautious about everything I did. I analyzed my surroundings, tried to fight the least amount of enemies possible, and hoped that I could make it out alive. This, in and of itself, demonstrates how immersed I was in the world. It was a gradual takeover, but as I progressed and got better at the game, the draw of the game for me became curiosity. What awaits me around that corner? Will I kill it? Will there be an ambush? Will it kill me? Each time I entered a new room, I felt the fear welling up inside my gut. I was paranoid, looking for another lantern so I didn't lose my hard-earned souls. Because I was so focused on not dying, it became a fear for me. If I found something that looked out of my league because it was designed to be scary as fuck, I avoided it like the plague. There's a giant in the cathedral ward who I wanted nothing to do with when I first encountered him. He was so big and so threatening that I ran like a fucking baby. It's not very often that a game will make me feel so at risk. The Lovecraftian theme really drives this home. The grotesque enemy designs make them hideous to look at, and most of them are downright scary in action and appearance, with creepy walk animations and even scarier attack shrieks. In Cainhurst Castle, you encounter beings that walk around as if they were giant spiders, but look more akin to a Cthulian abomination. They are really hard to fight, and they scared the shit out of me when I first fought one. Eventually, I just ran past, hoping I could make it into the castle alive. Even then, I had no idea what awaited me in the castle, so it was a crapshoot to begin with. In Hemwick Charnel Lane, everything is on fire, and there are deranged old witches laughing and shrieking when you come close. This area in particular gave me a lot of trouble because the spaces felt so enclosed and the enemies were so deranged and fast moving that I was absolutely terrified of progressing further. It's in this way that Bloodborne uses gameplay incentives, world building, and consequences to drive the player in certain directions. If you're confident, you'll go stumbling into big enemies no problem, but quickly realize you're out of your league. But if you're scared of everything, your playstyle becomes shaky. It becomes difficult to keep trekking onward. Yet, the curious side of every human always shines through and pushes you to keep exploring every nook and cranny of Yharnam. If Bloodborne wasn't such a captivating game, it would lose a lot of its spark. The initiative to keep playing the game for me was the rush of finding a new area and experiencing a new challenge. I was so immersed by the first boss fight that I had to keep finding more bosses. I needed more thrills and more things to be scared by. It was a strange, masochistic pleasure I felt the entire way through, and it's a feeling I can't say many other games have made me feel. While the areas aren't necessarily interconnected, they do make sense geographically and are expansive enough to impress the average player. Yharnam's world never reaches that oh my god spectacle of looping around back to the Firelink Shrine, but its art design coupled with its sheer size and scope more than make up for that. The various levels of Yharnam itself, be that in the Cathedral Ward, Old Yharnam, or the Healing Church, managed to impress me tenfold. It felt like a real city laid to waste by the unfortunate suffering of those who drank the old, corrupted blood. Odds are, if you can see it and the texture is high enough resolution, you can go there. When you finally reach the top of the Cathedral Ward and look back down upon what you just explored, a sense of accomplishment rises within you. You see just how much progress you've made, and in my case, I just sat there and marveled at it. I freaking love Yharnam, and it's my favorite Souls world to date. It scares the living shit out of me and is so aesthetically impressive that it blows my mind. It might just be my soft spot for H.P. Lovecraft, but I fell in love with Yharnam at first sight. The gameplay at its core is relatively the same. Same controls, same progression system, and same brutal difficulty. What has changed, however, is the feel of the combat. The main change this time around is the introduction of guns, because we're in Victorian London, so why the fuck not? In the beginning you can use a pistol or a blunderbuss, but your options expand as the game progresses. For instance, instance, if you up your strength to a ridiculous level, you can wield a goddamn cannon. Not quite sure how that works, but it's very effective at securing visceral attacks, which are essentially the follow-up parry attacks from previous games. The parry system works similarly to shields, except the timing is altered slightly. Instead of wanting the hit to connect with a shield, you need to shoot your gun while an enemy is just about to swing. When you get used to the timing, it feels as natural as parrying. Backstabbing was reworked as well, and it's no longer as easy as circling behind a foe and pressing the attack button. Instead, you need to charge up a heavy attack in the rear, and then they'll be stunned, allowing you to perform a visceral attack from behind. Backstabbing was always kind of broken in previous games, so I feel it's a welcome addition. You are required to use both a gun and a melee weapon. There exists one shield, but it's fucking pathetic, and really only there to demonstrate to you that this game operates much differently from the others. It's very fast-paced, for a few different reasons. In Souls games, you're typically on the defensive, waiting for an opening to tap into your opponent until you recluse back again to start dodging and tanking hits. It's slower paced and would actually be quite relaxing if it wasn't so incredibly difficult. Bloodborne still makes you read your opponent's moveset, but the addition of the sidestep and the new parry instead encourages you to play very aggressively. For example, if you see an enemy swing towards you, the general recommendation is to dash inward, because more often than not, it will work out well for you. This is where things get trickier, because it's not always so cut and dry. Since the bosses and enemies keep their sometimes sporadic attack patterns, if you aren't consistently dodging, you're going to get your shit wrecked. You need to time each sidestep and roll effectively to make sure you aren't taking damage, because as I said before, you don't have shield insurance anymore. In addition, you are incentivized to keep close to enemies because of the new health system. When I say new health system, I say it very loosely. Health works the same way as it did in other games, but now there's a window of time after getting hit where you can regain your lost HP. When you take a hit, your health bar drops, and in place of it is an orange section. This orange section represents the health you can gain back. To do this, you need to attack an enemy. The more you attack, the more health you get back, but since the orange area goes away after a few seconds, you need to act fast. Hence why I said this game is a lot faster paced. Your character moves a bit faster, is given more movement options, and you are rewarded for playing faster. It's a change, certainly, but one I welcome greatly. It's more of a personal preference, but I really enjoy the fast-paced feel of the combat. While the past games felt slow, I never felt that was a problem with the design, because it was a design choice intended to make the game feel more authentic. I just happen to prefer games that move faster. That isn't to say the game is much easier, because it still delivers the absurd challenge of previous games. At least it did for me, because it was my first time playing a Souls game. I would imagine for veteran players, the game could be seen as quite easy. I will admit, replaying the game, I did notice that there were several moments that felt a bit easier than normal Souls fare. But that doesn't mean there aren't hard moments in this game. Fighting the Shadows of Yharnam is fucking punishing. It's a 3-on-1 fight made fair because each boss goes down fairly quick. However you choose to dispatch them, the difficulty ramps up as you go along. When you kill one, the other two gain snake power-ups to make their reach longer and attacks more threatening. The final phase involves summoning giant snakes out of the ground to race at you and destroy you. All in all, it's extremely hard to survive each phase. When you finally do beat the boss, you feel as satisfied as you do with any other Souls game. The bosses in general are fantastic this time around. The blood-starved beast is an escalation of pure fear. He's quick, poisonous, and very, very deadly. For a newcomer, he's pretty overwhelming. He was by far my biggest wall in Bloodborne, largely because I was unaccustomed to dodging and the parry system. Even for the veteran Souls player, while not providing an immense challenge, he's still a fun fight. Dodging requires skill, and no doubt the satisfaction of killing the boss will follow suit. There are the occasional boss fights that feel slightly underwhelming, such as Rom, the vacuous spider. She summons a legion of spiders to defend her, which you need to defeat if you're ever going to reach Rom. Technically you can run through them, but they'll all pile drive you, and they do a surprising amount of damage. The fight quickly becomes a slog, with you needing to run behind every single spider to dispatch all of them, and then slashing at Rom a few times until she teleports away. Eventually, she can even fight back, throwing ice shards at you from the air and floor. She's kind of a complete joke, and even if you do struggle with her, I wouldn't say she's very satisfying to defeat in the end. Bloodborne doesn't hit it out of the park with every single one of its bosses, nor does any other Souls game, but the good bosses it does have are really fun fights that seriously test your mettle. I'd also like to touch on the aspect of replayability, since this is the only Souls game I've had to play to completion a second time around. Since this was the only game where I could discuss replay value, and all the games are generally the same, I'd like to address the replayability of the series in general. For me, being able to replay the game was a sort of paradigm shift. My first experience through any Souls game is solely about the world. Curiosity is my best friend, and I want to see each new area to find out what's around every corner and what new NPC side quest I could stumble upon. It's this happenstance exploration and adventure that keeps me going through my first playthrough, and that has a very heavy impact on my opinion of the game as a whole. This was the case with Bloodborne, and upon replaying the game again, my priority was a lot different. Since I knew where everything was, and generally knew what to expect, it became more about different ways to play the game. For instance, I decided to try out some arcane stuff, since I've never thought to dabble with any magic in the other games. The second playthrough was a lot more about searching for things I missed, checking out my different options with NPCs, and seeing if I could beat the bosses on my first try. Surely I could, since I know them so well. Nope. In short, I find the sheer variety of build choices coupled with the satisfaction of clearing a challenge to be reason enough to replay these games. Although the combat isn't terribly deep, it's always a battle of when you should dodge, when you should punish, and memorizing attack patterns. It's so satisfying, and was one of the reasons I kept through to the end a second time, despite how long the game is. Speaking of combat, it's largely unchanged this time around. You still have a strong and light attack that you alternate between, but this time around each of the weapons are trick weapons. What this means is that it has both a primary and a secondary form you can chain between. For instance, the saw cleaver you can pick as your starting weapon is both a short-range cleaver and a long-range cleaver. You can cycle in and out with relatively little issue. Then there's the threaded cane, which is a cane in one form and a fucking chain whip in the other form. It's so cool to play around with, and is one of the reasons I feel the criticism leveled toward the weapon selection in Bloodborne is unfounded. Let me explain. There are significantly less weapons in Bloodborne. Just counting melee weapons, you can only obtain 26 of them. Now, that sounds like a great deal until you compare it to the 113 melee weapons in Dark Souls 1, which again is also excluding ranged weapons. That's a pretty radical difference, but let me explain to you why I don't think it's such a big deal. The way weapons work in Dark Souls largely have to do with the type of weapon they are, and the animations of that weapon. If a weapon's animations aren't that great, people tend not to use it. The reason being that some animations are lacking in reach or size, and can be very ineffective compared to other weapon animations. The same goes for stats and general types of weapons, since some weapons just can't be used if you don't have the minimum stat requirements for it. The 113 number is a variation of axes, swords, daggers, hammers, etc. There are only 16 types of melee weapons, and each weapon falls into one of the 16 categories. Also, when you consider that trick weapons are essentially 2 weapons in one, we can double that 26 into a 52. That's still 113 versus 52, but honestly I never found the difference to be noticeable. If anything, the weapons in Dark Souls were just stat buffs or cosmetic additions, hardly anything significant. I think the trick weapons are cooler anyway, and add a lot more to the combat. Chaining a form into another mid-combo is super satisfying, and it makes the fast-paced combat feel all the better. Each weapon feels on par with one another, and that's something I just can't say for Dark Souls. Although I had a shit ton of stuff in my inventory, I only found a handful of it useful to begin with. And since you're locked into stat choices forever, it hardly encourages experimentation. Sadly, the same is true for Bloodborne. It can be fun to get a cool new weapon, but it sucks when you don't have the stats for it. It confuses me that the respec option from Dark Souls 2 wasn't utilized here, since it was a great addition to the series that could have prevented your inventory from being clogged with items you simply can't use. Speaking of your inventory, Bloodborne has changed how healing works. It's not exactly different from Estus. It heals you for a set amount of damage, and you can hold up to 20 at the beginning. Except, they don't regen anymore. They're a finite resource, something that baffles me. FromSoft would have you grinding enemies for blood echoes just to buy fucking vials. In other words, Bloodborne introduces the grind, something I'm not very happy with. The grind is intensified by the fact that Quicksilver bullets are finite as well. So you need to keep grinding blood echoes to refill your bullet and blood vial stocks just so you can advance to the next area, because good luck getting through this game without healing or bullets. It doesn't bother me that blood vials are used, but why can't they regen? You could balance it by bringing the cap down to about 5 or 10, and then the grind would be eliminated. Every time I see a game with grinding in it, I ask myself 2 questions. 1, is it fun to grind? 2, does this add anything to the game? The answer to both of these questions are unfortunately no. Once you get into the rhythm of fighting these wolves in Old Yharnam, because early game the wolves give a ridiculous amount of blood echoes, it easily becomes a chore. You clear out the area, run back to the lantern, clear out the area, run back to the lantern, rinse, repeat. I didn't even mention that there are load screens every time you activate a lantern and go back to the Hunter's Dream and then come back. It's especially annoying when you're ready to challenge the boss again, die miserably, and then are down to like 2 blood vials again. Back to the grind, then. It baffles me because it could have been avoided so easily. Another thing that baffles me is why they decided that you need to talk to someone to level up at your hub. The Nexus was a fine starting point for the series, but it is seriously annoying that I have to keep going back to the Hunter's Dream just to level up when a previous game in the series let you level up at any bonfire. She's the only fucking person here outside of Gehrman who is barely ever there, and I guess you could argue that you reinforce equipment at the Hunter's Dream, but you could also do that at bonfires in Dark Souls provided you had the right equipment. I just don't see why I have to go through a couple loading screens just to level up and continue. The process was streamlined in Dark Souls, and they've only ever gone backwards since in my eyes. The Hunter's Dream also opens up this game's answer to replay value, the Chalice dungeons. They're separated into 2 types, pre-made and randomly generated. The pre-made dungeons are what you find during the game and are designed deliberately. Same areas, enemies, and bosses. Those are fun for a hot minute until you realize they all feel the same and frequently recycle enemies and bosses. You'll quickly get a sense of deja vu in the later Chalice dungeons, and the worst part is that they hide newer bosses farther into the dungeon chains, so you have to slog through a bunch of boring, uninteresting hallways just to find cool new bosses that could have just been placed in the main game. Randomly generated dungeons aren't much better considering how uninteresting they are in the first place. It just means that there's slightly more variety because it's random and you can keep generating random dungeons. But there's only so much you can do with that, and after a while, the concept gets incredibly stale. I feel as though significant development time could have gone into a couple new areas instead of the Chalice dungeons. They really add nothing significant to the world and are more of a chore to complete than anything, with your only real reward being money, a few new weapons, and some cool new bosses, all of which sound great until you actually get into the dungeon. Fortunately, this isn't a Dark Souls 2 situation. Bloodborne finds a way to make up for its shortcomings in the best way possible. The highlights of Bloodborne's incredible boss battles, unique weapons, outstanding aesthetic, and scarily immersive world make it a joy to play through. You'll be afraid, you'll be on edge, you'll be tested, and you'll be satisfied. Bloodborne is a fantastic game, one that takes a departure from the established formula, but adds upon it in ways that I find enjoyable. It may not overtake Dark Souls for being my favorite game in the series, but I personally find it to be slightly better than Demon Souls and miles better than 2. I'm really glad Miyazaki was able to make something a little bit different than Dark Souls, but Namco Bandai can't have that. They need to milk this hype train for for everything they can get, so once again they contracted Miyazaki to work on a little game I like to call Dark Souls 3, which will be my next and final review in the Souls Marathon. Until then though, I hope you enjoyed this review and certainly have some well-deserved fun today.